Imagine returning home for Thanksgiving and never walking back out again. In the fall of 1974, three sisters Margaret, Ruth, and Helen McGoffin traveled deep into the Appalachian wilderness to their long-abandoned family home. It should have been a quiet holiday in a drafty old house on Pine Mountain. Instead, it became one of the most terrifying and complex mysteries the region has ever known. When authorities finally reached the property, they found no bodies, no struggle, just a house frozen in eerie normalcy. Dishes in the sink, beds still warm, personal belongings untouched. As investigators pushed deeper into the forest, into the basement, into a century of buried secrets, they uncovered something far darker than a disappearance. A hidden network, generational traditions, rituals no one dared speak aloud, and three sisters who may not have been victims, but participants. Before we dive into this chilling Appalachian mystery, tap like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever heard a story that stayed with you long after it ended? Your interaction helps this story reach more curious minds just like you. The final days of the McGoffin sisters began the moment their car turned off the paved road and onto the narrow dirt path leading toward their childhood home, a route that curled through 12 miles of dense Appalachian forest, across the creek beds, and into an isolation most people today cannot imagine. Margaret, Ruth, and Helen had not lived under the same roof for over a decade. Yet something never fully explained pulled them back to that two-story wooden house, built by their grandfather in 1896. The home had stood empty for nearly 2 years after their father's death, slowly surrendering to weather and time. Neighbors occasionally saw smoke rise from the chimney earlier that fall, a quiet sign someone had been trying to make the place livable again. But no one knew which sister it was. When the trio stopped at Cohn's General Store on November 21st, their demeanor was subdued. Their purchases practical: food, kerosene, batteries. Ruth asked about the weather as if early snow might be the least of their concerns. The store owner later said nothing about them seemed strange, but something about the silence between them lingered in his mind long after they left. As the sisters reached the property and stepped inside the old house, they were walking into more than a holiday weekend. They were walking back into a legacy, thick with secrecy. This land had held their family for generations. Yet no one in the county ever seemed to know much about the McGoffins beyond whispers of privacy and odd traditions. The house itself felt frozen in time, creaking floors, souring wallpaper, a coal fireplace waiting for flame. But beneath the floorboards and behind the quietness of those walls, the weight of unfinished family business seemed to settle round them. Letters found years later hinted at disagreements, things that needed to be settled, and questions father never answered. But in 1974, no one outside the family knew about those tensions. All anyone knew was that 3 women went into that old house for Thanksgiving, and not one of them ever walked back down that dirt road again. The next time anyone approached the home, a week later, the fire had gone cold, the beds were still rumpled, the dishes still in the sink. It looked as if the sisters had just stepped out for a moment, expecting to return. Instead, their absence marked the beginning of the most disturbing Appalachian mystery of the decade. When Deputy James Crawford reached the McGoffin house on November 28th, exactly 1 week after the sisters were last seen, the first thing that struck him was the stillness. Not the natural quiet of the mountains, but a silence that felt staged, as if someone had pressed pause on the house itself. The front door was unlocked. Inside, nothing appeared ransacked or disturbed. In fact, everything looked normal to normal. 3 beds had clearly been slept in, their blankets wrinkled in a way that suggested the women had expected to return to them. A meal had been eaten, the dishes rinsed but left in the sink, waiting to be washed later. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but it was long extinguished, leaving only cold ash. Margaret's purse sat on a small table near the stairs, untouched ID, money, everything inside. The house wasn't abandoned. It was paused mid-breath, and that, Crawford later wrote, was more unsettling than any sign of struggle could have been. He moved through each room, searching for clues that might suggest where the sisters had gone. But every detail deepened the mystery. No coats missing from the hooks, no packed bags, no footprints outside that survived the weather, and no indication, none at all, that 3 adult women had chosen to leave willingly. Had they stepped outside to investigate a noise? Did someone they knew arrive unexpectedly? Or had something inside the house drawn them out? The early snowfall had erased any tracks that might have told that story. Over the next several days, search teams combed the surrounding forest, calling their names into the foggy ridgelines of Pine Mountain. But the woods answered only with wind. In the small community of Salyersville, where the McGoffins were known for keeping to themselves, theories spread quietly, almost reluctantly. Some believed the sisters had fled. Others whispered that the land itself was cursed. But those who knew the family best said the same chilling thing. Whatever happened to them began long before that Thanksgiving weekend. And as investigators peeled back the layers of evidence in the months to come, they would learn just how true and how horrifying that statement was. The mystery surrounding the sisters deepened in the summer of 1975, when Curtis Fleming, a local man who hunted ginseng in the deep woods, stumbled on something he couldn't explain. 2 miles northeast of the McGoffin property, he found what looked like a makeshift campsite, a cold fire ring, scattered clothing that appeared to be women's garments, and claw-like scratches carved into the bark of nearby trees. At first glance, it seemed like the site of a panicked struggle, but upon closer inspection, investigators realized the clothing hadn't been torn, they'd been cut, arranged in a deliberate pattern around the fire pit. The shallow, body-sized depressions in the soil around the clearing made this scene even more unsettling. These weren't natural indentations. Someone had dug them, filled them back in, then left no explanation behind. And the scratches on the trees, deep, desperate grooves dragged downward, looked painfully human, as if made by someone trying to anchor themselves against something unthinkable. When forensic specialist Dr. Martin Hensley examined the scene, he confirmed what investigators already feared. This was no ordinary campsite. The clothing was deteriorated, but likely belonged to the sisters. The soil depressions were deliberate, and the scratches formed a pattern of distress that was impossible to ignore. Yet for all the alarming details, the site refused to tell a complete story. No bones, no bodies, No clear signs of who had been there or why. Just the chilling sense that whatever occurred had happened months earlier, and that it was carried out with intent. Locals began whispering about rituals, about old mountain superstitions, about the McGoffin family's reputation for secrecy. Search teams widened their efforts, convinced the forest held more answers. They were right. The first campsite was only the beginning. Within weeks, investigators would discover another clearing miles away, one stranger, darker, and far more carefully constructed. And it would push the investigation from a missing person case into something far more disturbing. The investigation shifted from disturbing to downright inexplicable in October 1975, when a mining survey crew stumbled onto a clearing that, by all logic, shouldn't have existed. For miles southwest of the McGoffin home, in a region so densely forested that sunlight barely reached the ground, the surveyors found a perfect circle carved into the wilderness, an open patch of soil where no trees grew at all. The ground was dark, almost unnaturally rich, as if saturated with organic material investigators couldn't identify. Around the perimeter stood a ring of trees carved with symbols, straight lines, intersecting angles, crude geometric shapes, none of which matched any local folklore or indigenous markings. Even stranger, the symbols were fresh. Someone had been returning to that clearing regularly, carving new marks into the bark even as the old ones healed. And the odor that drew the survey crew there in the first place, the faint, sweet rot rising from the earth, hinted at something beneath the surface that investigators never managed to definitively trace. Dr. Hensley examined the site and admitted what few professionals ever do. He had no idea what he was looking at. The clearing was too deliberate, the markings too consistent, the soil too enriched to be natural. If the first campsite hinted at ritualistic behavior, this second site screamed it. Rumors spread quickly across McGoffin County. Some residents claimed the family had always been different, that strange lights and distant cries had drifted from their land for decades. Others whispered about an older tradition, one passed through the McGoffin women, where secrets were protected at any cost. Officially, investigators logged the site as unclassified activity, but privately many believed it was the epicenter of whatever had consumed the sisters. Because if this clearing was tied to them, it suggested something even more chilling. The women hadn't simply disappeared. They had been preparing for something their ancestors had done long before them. And whatever happened here, whatever purpose the clearing served, it was likely the key to understanding the dark inheritance they never escaped. As investigators dug into the McGoffin family's past, they found a lineage threaded with secrecy, tragedy, and patterns too precise to ignore. For generations, the property on Pine Mountain had passed not through the sons as was customary in Appalachian families, but through the women. Each time a male heir was positioned to inherit, he either died young, suffered an unexplained accident, or disappeared altogether. County records showed this repeatedly, dating back to Elijah McGoffin's eldest son, who vanished months before Elijah's death, shifting the inheritance to his daughter. This pattern repeated through each generation like clockwork. Neighbors who had known the family for decades described the McGoffin women as intelligent, but distant, private to a degree that bordered on unsettling. Their mother, Sarah, was known for mountain remedies and herbal knowledge, yet she became increasingly reclusive in her later years. When she died in 1968, the circumstances were quietly disturbing. Found dressed in her finest clothes at her kitchen table, hands scratched, furniture overturned, and yet her death was ruled simple heart failure. Her husband Thomas's death 5 years later carried its own set of questions. He was discovered in the barn after an apparent fall from the hayloft, but his formal clothing, the strangely angled ladder, and the deliberate arrangement of hay suggested something more staged than accidental. More troubling were the scattered family documents and photos found around him items. His daughters later claimed not to recognize, yet were desperate to recover. As these stories emerged, investigators began seeing a pattern that stretched beyond coincidence. A family that had carefully guarded its inner workings for nearly a century. And the three sisters Margaret, Ruth, and Helen had grown up inside that system. Their childhood writings, found later in the basement, hinted at lessons learned there, punishments for speaking to outsiders, and traditions they were expected to continue. By the time the women returned home for Thanksgiving in 1974, they weren't stepping into a forgotten childhood home. They were returning to a generational obligation rooted in silence, obedience, and fear, and something in that house, or in the land around it, had been waiting for them to finish what their parents had begun. The most chilling discoveries of the entire investigation surfaced in the spring of 1976, when authorities finally conducted a deep, methodical search of the McGoffin house specifically. The basement that had been dismissed early on as a simple root cellar. What they found was nothing resembling a cellar at all. The space had been deliberately enlarged, the stone walls recently reworked, and heavy objects had clearly been dragged across the floor. Most disturbing were the iron restraint rings embedded into the stone hardware, installed with intentional spacing and height, as if designed to hold a person in place. The stone around the rings bore stress marks. The floor held chemical traces of bodily fluids long since degraded. Scratches gouged into the walls matched the same distressed patterns found on the trees near the forest campsites. This wasn't storage. It wasn't accidental. It was a chamber built for confinement. A place someone had used, maybe recently, maybe for years. But the true revelation lay beneath a single loose stone in the floor. Hidden there was a small cache of personal items, jewelry belonging to Sarah McGoffin, old family photographs, and most damning handwritten documents spanning multiple generations. These writings, composed by different members of the family across nearly a century, read like a fragmented ledger of rituals, obligations, and punishments. Sarah's entries spoke of methods grandmother taught me for keeping order in the house. Thomas wrote of preparations that must be made and ensuring traditions continued. Even when we are gone, the daughter's childhood writings were the hardest to read. Fearful notes about lessons in the basement, warnings about what happens to those who speak, and references to duties they would someday inherit. The final entries, dated near 1973, suggested the family was preparing to complete the work that has been started. For investigators, this changed everything. The basement wasn't just a crime scene, it was a generational blueprint. And when Margaret, Ruth, and Helen returned home for Thanksgiving in 1974. They likely weren't revisiting nostalgic memories. They were fulfilling the next chapter of a tradition their family had spent decades perfecting in the shadows. What investigators uncovered next pushed the MacGuffin case far beyond the boundaries of one family. As researchers and state authorities dug into old court documents, property maps, and genealogical ties, they found that the MacGuffins were not an isolated anomaly. They were part of a web of mountain families spread across eastern Kentucky, each owning remote tracts of land marked by the same secrecy, the same strange inheritance patterns, and the same historical trail of disappearances. These weren't rumors or folklore. They were documented cases stretching back nearly a century. Travelers who vanished near specific homesteads, unexplained lights and cries reported by locals, modified basements and outbuildings designed for confinement, and disturbed earth hinting at unmarked graves. Many of these properties, when searched, contained evidence chillingly similar to the MacGuffin basement: restraints, carvings, ritual-like arrangements, and hidden journals. The writings suggested the family shared a belief system rooted in ancestral customs, one that framed outsiders as threats and demanded silence, secrecy, and elimination of anyone who might expose their hidden world. The more investigators uncovered, the more obvious it became that this was organized, multi-generational criminal activity, not the isolated madness of a single household. And like the MacGuffins, these families funneled power through their daughters. The writings and historical records implied a matriarchal system, women trained from childhood to uphold the traditions, maintain secrecy, and select or neutralize perceived threats. Male heirs consistently died or disappeared before inheriting properties, suggesting they were either unwilling or unfit to participate. By the mid-1970s, authorities identified over 40 properties linked to this clandestine network. But by then, it was almost too late. Many individuals tied to the families had either died, disappeared, or refused to speak. Others insisted the practices had ended long ago and denied any involvement. With no living witnesses and physical evidence scattered across dozens of remote sites, prosecution became nearly impossible. What the investigation did make clear, however, was this: whatever swallowed the MacGuffin sisters didn't come from a single moment of violence or panic. It emerged from a network built, refined, and protected over generations, one that saw the outside world as a danger to be extinguished, and its own daughters as the keepers of secrets buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains. As the investigation expanded, a grim realization took hold. Margaret, Ruth, and Helen MacGuffin may not have gone back to Pine Mountain as victims. They may have returned as active participants in a family system they were born into and never fully escaped. The evidence suggested careful preparation, supplies purchased for an extended stay, the basement modifications, the ritual-like arrangements at the campsites. These weren't the actions of women planning a quiet Thanksgiving. But somewhere in that process, somewhere between the first night in the old house and their final moments in the forest, something turned violently against them. Investigators theorized that the sisters may have disagreed on how to continue their family's traditions, or perhaps one of them attempted to break away. The journals hinted at growing tension, unresolved questions father never answered, and obligations they felt unprepared to fulfill. If the sisters were carrying out a ritual, a confinement, or a selection process, any conflict among them could have triggered chaos. And in a system built on absolute secrecy, any misstep would invoke the harshest consequences. Another possibility emerged, one even more chilling. The McGoffins were not the only family guarding these traditions. Evidence across the region pointed to an interconnected network, and some of those families may have been monitoring the sisters' return. Perhaps Margaret, Ruth, and Helen were expected to perform certain duties and failed to meet those expectations. Perhaps they were seen as a liability after their father's death and the initial discovery of unusual activity on their land. If so, the scratches on the trees, the body-sized depressions, and the carefully arranged clothing may not have belonged to victims the sisters were preparing, but to the sisters themselves, trapped by the very system they were expected to uphold. Investigators concluded that the three women likely died during Thanksgiving weekend of 1974. But where, how, and at whose hands remains unknown. Their remains were never found. What is clear is that whatever ended their lives came from inside the traditions they inherited, whether through internal conflict, betrayal from allied families, or ritual consequences carried out by people who knew exactly how to make their disappearance permanent. By late 1976, the McGoffin case was no longer simply overwhelming, it was dangerous. Not because of some lurking supernatural force, but because the investigation had begun touching nerves in communities that did not want their secrets exposed. As state authorities uncovered more properties with similar basements, journals, and evidence of confinement, they also encountered a wall of silence. Families who had lived in these hollows for generations suddenly stopped answering questions. Local officials insisted the reports were exaggerated. Documents went missing from county offices. And then came the most unsettling event, the mysterious death of Professor Elizabeth Morrison, the historian whose research first uncovered the generational patterns tying these families together. Found at the bottom of a dimly lit stairwell in 1982, her death was officially ruled accidental, but colleagues noticed immediately that her research files, specifically those relating to the McGoffin lineage and the network of linked families, had been disturbed, with several key documents missing. For investigators familiar with the case's patterns, the message was unmistakable. Someone was still protecting the old system. Behind closed doors, the investigation was quietly shuttered. State records were sealed in 1978 under the justification of ongoing sensitive matters, and have remained inaccessible ever since. Without the ability to prosecute, to name suspects, to identify bodies, to map the full network, the case effectively collapsed. As mining companies purchased land across eastern Kentucky, including the former McGoffin property, demolition crews reported finding additional disturbed earth and structural modifications. But by then the official inquiry was long over. No follow-up searches were conducted. No public warnings were issued. Instead, the land was left to the forest, and the families involved faded back into the anonymity of the mountains. Authorities, exhausted and facing political pressure, issued the conclusion that the McGoffin sisters likely died in 1974 under violent, circumstances, but no one was ever identified as responsible. For the people who lived near Pine Mountain, the message was simple and chilling. Don't ask questions. Don't stir the old stories. And never, ever go near the place where the McGoffin house once stood. The silence that followed wasn't just avoidance, it was survival. Today, Pine Mountains stands quiet, reclaimed by the forest, but the legacy of what happened there refuses to fade. The foundations of the old McGoffin house are still visible beneath layers of moss and fallen branches, a ghostly outline of a home that sheltered more secrets than anyone realized. Hunters and hikers occasionally wander near the area, only to report unsettling sensations, trees marked in ways they can't explain, ground that seems freshly disturbed despite decades of abandonment, or an eerie silence that descends without warning. For long-time residents, these stories are not surprising. They have lived with this history for generations, taught to keep their family traditions private and their suspicions unspoken. Even now, families with deep Appalachian roots rarely discuss ancestry in detail, and certain horrors remain deliberately avoided. The McGoffin case became more than a mystery. It became a boundary line and unspoken agreement that some parts of the mountains are better left alone. The broader impact reverberates far beyond Kentucky. The investigation revealed something most people never imagined: how geographic isolation, cultural loyalty, and generational secrecy could enable systematic wrongdoing to flourish unchecked for nearly a century. It forced law enforcement to rethink how missing person cases were handled, how rural crime networks could operate without detection, and how trauma can be inherited silently through generations. Yet the full truth remains sealed literally within locked state archives and missing research notes, accessible only to a handful of officials. Whether the criminal network dissolved, relocated, or still operates quietly in the deeper reaches of Appalachia is a question no one can confidently answer, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most haunting legacy of all. The story of the McGoffin sisters is not just a tale of disappearance. It's a reminder that darkness can anchor itself in places where silence is tradition, and isolation provides cover. Somewhere, filed away in boxes no one is allowed to open, the answers sit waiting. But in the shadow of Pine Mountain, the wind carries its own warning. Some truths were buried for a reason.